Okay, so Gloria, you have the power to bring back any extinct species. Which one do you want to bring back to the world, and why did you choose that one?
Oh my gosh, that's such a great question. I think the woolly mammoth. And then like there was this enormous like beaver, like dinosaur, like beaver of the past. I feel like I would love to see that animal in real life. Like massive, like it was like huge, 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 like
You mean
size
like
of
the size of like
baby
a Labrador
hippo.
retriever or a hippo? Okay,
Yeah,
wow, an enormous
like
beaver.
really big. So I feel like I would love to see a woolly mammoth and just like be near one. Yeah.
I think when I was coming up with the question, I was thinking that maybe I'd want the Tasmanian tiger, just because they are. I mean, there's some argument that maybe they aren't actually extinct, but I don't really believe that. Just wishful thinking. But they're so odd. It's like a dog and a cat, but it's a marsupial. Like that's just
Ooh.
crazy.
I'm gonna look one up right after this.
So, hello, and welcome to the Author Takeover special edition of the Speculative Sandbox podcast. I'm your guest host, Alisa Alering, author of Smothermoss. And today I'm going to talk about hope and dystopia with Gloria Munoz, whose gorgeous YA climate fiction novel, This Is the Year, just came out in January. And in just a minute, I'm going to ask Gloria to tell us more about the book, but I thought we should start with a little primer on the origins and history of dystopia. Uh, the Oxford English Dictionary, which all of us word nerds love, defines it as an imaginary place or condition in which everything is as bad as possible. Um, and it turns out that the word dystopia actually came about as the opposite of utopia, at least in the English language. So there's an original book called Utopia by Sir Thomas More in, I think, 1516. And it describes an island where everything's as best as it could possibly be, although it is a satire. So he's still not really believing in that best of all possible world. And then it's like a couple hundred years before somebody uses the word dystopia, and that's actually in a speech to parliament. So it's a political coinage. It's not a literature coinage. And when we get to dystopia. So before I ask Gloria whether or not she thinks that she's written a dystopia, the worst of all possible worlds, can you just introduce us to This Is the Year? What's it about, and who are we going to meet?
Yes. This is a year is a work of climate fiction that feels like it's a step to the left or right of where we are right now. There's no time in the book. It's meant to feel like it could be 25 years from now, 150 years from now, 500 years from now, depending on the choices that we make environmentally. It's a book about a young girl named Huli who lost her sister and she's grieving, but has had like this very heavy year of grief and of isolation, like just separating herself from her friends, her family, and really reconsidering what she wants. And the book begins at the start of the year where she and Ophelia, her late sister, had these big plans to take over the world together and to like, after school, like leave Florida and do all these like radical things together. And Huli has to figure out how to move forward, like how to navigate that and like those big dreams without her sister, but also just how to exist as a high schooler. There's a space program that intersects, it's like a militaristic space program that intersects with her plans and is a bright, shiny star because this whole time she's thinking, oh, I'll just get out of the state. But then the space program presents the opportunity for her to leave the planet, which what could be better than not rekindling friendships and not having to, feel the difficult, very heavy feelings than getting in a spaceship. So that's where we meet Julieta, and it's a book about friendship. It's a book about hope. I set out to write a hopeful cli-fi because I love climate fiction, but everything I had read had felt rather bleak. And yeah, and it's a really fun book despite it also being a book that's very challenging. And I think that challenges a lot of our perceptions around technology and, the future we all dream of.
Yeah. So mentioning the hope part, that's why I thought this episode should be called Hopeful Dystopia, because, when I crack the book and I start reading those really dark scenes of her in these dilapidated of post-luxury apartment buildings, I guess they used to be nice, but they're not cared for anymore. And sort of climate refugees have moved in. It feels very dark, even to the William Gibson neuromancer level of darkness. And at the same time, it's like, but this is not a depressing book, despite the depressing surroundings. And as you were talking there, I was thinking that there were really two strong things that feel to me like every teenager ever, which is, especially if you live in a small town, you're like, this is the worst place ever.
Yeah. Yes.
And, the real world is somewhere else, and I am going to get out of here. And that's a sort of teenage also view of history where I am living in the worst moment in time. I think no matter when it is, everybody thinks that. Um,
Mhm.
I I might be inclined to agree with today's young people that they might be right. But, which leads me to my next question is, what do you think that reading about a fictional dystopia offers to people, especially young people, at a time when they might already feel like they're living in a dystopian world? Why would they want to read about bad things happening, especially ones that are so close to, they're not fantastical bad things happening. These are really believable bad things happening that are like they're almost like they're real circumstances. So what's the value of putting that in fiction?
I feel like in dystopic work, people have a lot less choice than we have right now. Things are, and so it is, right? Like they're set up, and those are the rigid structures, and people have to figure out how to move and operate between them, and like they can make those choices, but in terms of like moving the needle, it's a lot more difficult. Um, in reality, we can also feel like that, right? If we think about climate change and who can actually, make a big swing and have actual like affect change for the heating globe, for tides rising, for the amount of garbage that we'll produce on this planet, it's truly the billionaires of the world, right? But at the same time, just within the past few weeks, like we've seen stocks of major corporations plummet and shift because of people making choices collectively. So I think that the ability to change things and to shift and to make choice is something that differentiates the two. And what's fun for me about a dystopic book or like a book with kind of with these constraints is that you then have to figure out like where is the fun? Like where is the hope or where's the beating heart of this character? Like how they exist outside of the setting that they've been put into. And for Huli and her friends, they are teenagers. And I kept thinking like teenagers are going to be teenagers even at the end of the world, even when everything feels like it's gone to hell, like they are always going to be themselves. And this is something I've seen repeatedly from working with kids. Like I've worked in all kinds of spaces, like from juvenile detention centers to I used to run workshops with like foster kids or kids who lived in group homes and like we would write stories, and yes, some of them were really, really harrowing, but some of them were really, really hilarious and funny and spunky. And they, the minutia, like the drama of high schoolers is always going to be there. So I really wanted to tap into that and tap into kids who had dreams despite and maybe in spite of everything. So I feel like hope for me, it was like at the front of my mind. Like I didn't want it to be so explicit that it felt like, oh, everything's going to be fine for them because at the, like throughout the book, like they're always tricky, even like how we land, like it's still like there's still a lot to be done and everything is still complicated and confusing. Um, but they have a lot of moments of like feeling the benefits of mutual aid, feeling the benefits of community, and feeling like again the like absolute hilarity and just like the wild romp of being in high school and of like discovering hobbies and discovering friends and discovering like who you are outside of someone's, shadow or outside of your grief. Or with your grief, because I don't think, grief ever really leaves us. It's like who you are walking alongside your grief and like how you learn to like, instead of making it something that feels really heavy, like an anvil, like maybe making it this like wild balloon animal you're with and get to spend time with. And I feel like Huli's arc, because of that, like I really love her as a character, just because I feel like she changes and learns and discovers and um, becomes like a great example of like what humans can do in difficult times, right? Like the one thing we can do really well is change, but it's the one thing we're very resistant to.
I do think that we are more malleable when we're young to those things, to really big sort of like left turn changes. It does happen in later life too, but um, teenagers are primed for that. One of the things that you were saying sort of at the beginning of that answer was like how to make dystopia fun or like what's fun in a dystopia. So that leads me to wonder whether you are a regular reader of dystopian. Like, do you enjoy those novels as a reader? And I'm thinking of classics like 1984 by George Orwell, or even something more modern class like The Handmaid's Tale by Margaret Atwood, which a lot of people now know from the TV adaptation. You know, do you find satisfaction in reading those things? And were you thinking of any of those books, anything in particular, when you were writing This Is the Year?
Yes, I love science fiction. I love speculative dystopic work. I always have. It's like the cereal of my life. I just find it so illuminating for our current lives. There's so many things. I'm a huge Margaret Atwood fan. There's so many things in like the Oryx and Crake cycle that like as they have happened I mean, I've read those books like a couple times. Like as I've read like that cycle of books, I'll suddenly see something appear from one of the books in real life, and I'm like, it's happening right now. And I love that. I love again how they feel like a shade of our world. So I love, Station 11 was just like a monumental book for me. The first book I read on my own, well, I read it with my dad, like outside of school, was Contact by Carl Sagan. And that was a book that just like we read out loud together, and he was really into sci-fi, and it was one of those books that really stood out to me. Again, it's not dystopic, but it like kind of pushes the edges of our world and like makes us think about physics in a new way and about dimensions. Um, Other dystopic books that I love are Sanctuary by Paula Mendoza and Abby Shear. Um, I Love Dealing in Dreams by Lillian Rivera, also, which is YA. And then other books that feel like they're like, oh, actually, this is dystopic. The Last Cuentista by Barbara Higuera. It's just like a fantastic, like far future world with like incredible world building. It won, I think it won the Newbery. Um, so yeah, I love dystopic fiction. I love dystopic television also. I've been very into Silo as of late. And yeah, I love things that feel like they see our world and then like they explode it and then figure out how to shape a setting.
Okay. Um, there was a list of great books. I need to go back after this. It's finished. This interview is finished, and write down some of them and check them out, especially that last one that I hadn't heard of.
So good.
So there's all kinds of dystopias. There's a lot of them rely on totalitarian control and repression of the arts and a lot of like personal agency. And I don't see that so much in This Is the Year. I think the strongest, most dystopian element is the stuff that extrapolates from climate change and the dangers of climate change. Red tides and toxic seawater excess heat, which we were already facing, but like just turned up to 11 or 12. Lots of rain, more extinct species, those sort of awful tides of dead and injured animals that wash up on the beach. So why did climate change end up being sort of the central focus of this fictional dystopia?
Well, I live in Florida, which feels dystopic on any given day, to be quite honest. Um, and I've lived here, I grew up here, I moved away and moved back here, and nothing feels as severe to me weather-wise as this state. I don't know if it's because of the extreme heat in the summer and the humidity and or the like fact that we're surrounded by water that like at any given day like you could be driving across a bridge and like the you see the water like actually like reaching up to the bridge. So it just feels like a setting that is giving us all the warning signs of climate change again and in a cyclical way, right? Again and again. Every year we see this. Every year we have red tide. Sometimes it's so bad, like quite literally, it like is a sting in your nostrils, like when you walk outside. Um, I was writing this book when the pandemic, like it was like the end of 2019 when I started it. And then when the pandemic started, I was like, oh no, this is actually like a book. Like I'm going to sit down and move forward here. Because initially I was just writing these poems, like climate focused poems. And like I was thinking a lot about Florida because I don't know if I'm going to, continue to live here forever. But it's one of those places that like while I'm here, I really want to write about it. And I dig into my community and love the work people are doing. Like I'm really inspired by the work people are doing to advocate for climate, to help animals, etc. So I was sitting at this park, and I think it was right at the start of the pandemic, and I had like written all these poems, and I had a very, very, very young kid at the time. I think they would be categorized as an infant at that time, and they're like rolling around this blanket, and then like finally like settled down, and I had my laptop, and I was like sitting at this park by the water that I would go to and because everything else was closed. It wasn't even like a park. It was just like a little like side area like with grass because a lot of places were closing down and all, the whole like all of our classes, like everything had shut down. And I was looking across the water at these very nice houses, like beautiful like mansions. And I just had this moment of like doing this exercise and thinking like, okay, what do those look like in 10 years? Okay, what do those look like in 50 years? What do they look like in 100 years? What do they look like in 500 years? Will they be here in 500 years? Like right against the water on the, right across where I was looking from. And that's where I started building out the setting of this book and thinking, aha, like this is actually like a book length work and it needs to be set right here because this place, like how I see it, shifting every year. I mean, this year after back-to-back hurricanes, Helene and Milton, like it looks like a different place. It truly does. Like it's wild. And like you look up like everything from like the tree canopies and like how they've snapped and regrown to how things have been repaired to the corroding of streets and like these there's a lot of sinkholes that have been filled post these two hurricanes. So it just looks like and feels like a different place. And that's just in 1 year. And it happens every year. And we don't notice it until it is catastrophic, like this year was. It truly, this year was a lot. Um, but yeah, I was like, this is on the brink of truly changing, like truly transforming. And that's where I was like, this, it has to be set here. And, it's going to be in a more dilapidated, accelerated. I like that dial because I usually use that like metaphor of like, it's this world, but like at 11 or 12, Um, and sometimes it feels like we're closer to five because again, sometimes things can feel very severe and very scary.
I love that the sort of kernel that propelled you into a book was this visual imagination of what was right in front of you, of sort of going from here and literally picturing the future of the landscape in front of you. Like I'm a very visual image-based person, and I can see that. I can sort of be like, yes, like you're putting the layers over what you're seeing, and you're making them more decayed. And then like, but what if it was a little? Ooh, yeah.
Yeah.
The other thing that you mentioned in there is that you started by you were sort of in this maybe like a bit of an aimless time with the pandemic and everything, and you're writing poetry in a park. And of course, the book does include some poems and verses, and I believe they're supposed to be. I mean, it's all in Huli's voice, but they're supposed to be things that she writes in her notebook. So they are literally her own poetry. So, how do you feel that poetry works with dystopia? I mean, I think it works really well, but why is poetry a good way to talk about sort of our dystopian feelings or the deterioration of the physical world?
So the poems are in there and they're meant to feel like a little bit of Huli's subconscious uh and of what she's sitting with, what she's mulling over, what she's struggling with. They're very vulnerable, and on the exterior, she's like truly like goth, just like a little rough around the edges. Like she's not vulnerable or someone who you would expect to sit down and write a poem. Um, but I love that, right? Because there's no true archetype for who can write poetry. And I think we all have this like almost like a poet in our minds that's constantly annotating or saying like, look, like really look at this. Like this is a moment of awe and wonder. Like log it, And like when you do that, it's like you're acting like a poet. And like so we're all doing that. We all jump from the literal to the figurative all the time. So she's just tuning into that part of herself. And while the book came from an assignment, like this, like writing poems came from an assignment for her, like having the journal, having this book that she like writes into, it's something that eventually she finds she really loves because she's very resistant about talking about feelings of any kind. You see it with her therapist, Martha, who she absolutely loathes. You see it with like most adults. Um, but here, her feelings can kind of be right out there in the open. And she can blame people and she can be angry and she can be sad and messy in those poems. And I love that for her. Like, I think, the point of a poem is to make you feel something or to make you question something or relive something twice, so much that you feel it. And I think they do that for her in a way that, like, she doesn't yet know how to express verbally or like in the exterior world.
Right. I was thinking a couple of things. I'm like, do you think she's going to keep writing poetry after as she grows up? Will she keep with it?
I hope so. I hope so. I mean, there's a huge I don't know what will get people to care about the planet. But I think the like all roads lead back to like the arts as like being like one of the only things that will actually like make people like, okay, let me think about this. Because everything else feels like noise sometimes, especially when it's so heightened. So I would, in my future imagination of Huli, she's, writing poetry, being a planet advocate, like doing these things and really discovering who she is more and more, and maybe doing it for herself, but maybe also sharing that work.
You mentioned that you didn't think that she was necessarily the kind of person who would be writing poetry, but she reminded me of my own teenage self, like dressed all in black and like moping around, carrying a notebook with a pen and writing down all my very deep thoughts and my very personal agonies. So,
Yes. Same,
uh,
same.
so the other aspect I think about Hui's tale is that she's really in deep mourning for her sister. I mean, it seems like it's been, is it correct, less than a year since her sister died because she's saying, this is the year we were going to do these things and now you aren't here with me. And she actually, the whole book is in a way addressed to her sister Ophelia as Ophe, which she calls her. And so she'll be like, "Oh, we were going to do this, Ophe," like, or you should have done this. So, I mean, it's really a grief perspective. Like the whole thing comes from that. And she's got grief that's personal, but then it seems like the dying planet is like another kind of grief. So did you make that connection to sort of like intimate grief and the broader grief? Did that just sort of come up as you got further into the book? Like, how did you make, I guess this is more of a writer, question. How did those choices come about? Like, were they very organic? Did you know at the beginning that they were connected?
Hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. So because I write poetry and like initially had been thinking about this book as like a collection of poems, not with characters, not with this world. I had been reading a lot about climate fiction. I'm sorry, climate poetry, or ecopoetics. I think that's the term that's used, ecopoetics. I've been reading a lot about ecopoetics and about grieving the environment and grieving species, like fully wiped out species of, animals. And the question that kept coming up again and again is like, who gets to grieve when that grief belongs to everyone? And like, how do we mourn something collectively? How do we also then like another big question with ecopoetics is like, how do you re-enter and like sit with nature and observe, or not even observe, like just like be in it or be a part of it without an agenda, like without wanting something from it. And it's like this like relearning of how to exist in a world that is constantly losing. Um, and I think that like elegiac state, like there's like this like elegiac blanket around this book where for the environment, right? And for this world that is rapidly changing. And then on a personal level, it's like we know how to grieve, but we don't know how to like collectively take care of each other. So like when somebody loses, it's like get back to it. It's like you have your 2 weeks, get back if you get 2 weeks. I think it's like 4 days or whatever you get. I don't know. But if that. And I think we don't know how to care for each other. And there was definitely some of that going on with when I was setting out to write this book because um Huli has had like one of the worst losses you can imagine. And yet she's still in school. Like she's still moving forward. She still has like to care about next steps. And she's not really getting the help despite her community like trying to be there. She's not getting the help that she needs. So I think it's like kind of twofold. It's like, how do we like maybe all mourning, maybe all grief is collective. Like I feel like we say like personal grief and it like puts all the onus and the weight of that grief on one person. But if you have someone in your life who's grieving and who's going through a really hard time, like, isn't that your grief too? And isn't that like, the ripple effect of that? Like, I just feel like that community and like my church is mutual aid, like in so many ways. Like I just am like, it's the one thing that like actually makes sense to me. And I feel like there could be more of a like mutual approach to caring for someone who's grieving, and then also for like how we collectively hold on to everything we've lost, like as a society, but also look ahead together and like figure out like, okay, how do we move forward or plan for a future world together?
So somewhere in there, you said that, her community was trying to care for her, I guess, but it wasn't working. Like, do you think that's the feeling of the community, or do you think there's just something about her and her grief that's sort of untouchable and like they wouldn't, grief can be so devastating that it just separates you from other people and it can be as well-meaning as they want, but it can't get there, I guess.
Yeah, I think it's both. I think um everything is so structured, right? Like the classes, the therapy, the volunteer hours, like the this, the that. It's like the approach is like, let's show up and like give her things to do, you know? But it isn't until her frenemy, Janine, who I really loved writing this character, but it isn't until Janine introduces Huli to roller derby that she is like back in her body. I feel like for the beginning of the book, like she exists a little bit like outside of her body or in her head fully. And she's like in her body and like willing to make mistakes and willing to like look like a mess and just like have fun. Um, and it's like the complete counter to what you think like somebody might want when they're grieving, like to get like knocked down or to look like foolish in front of like a bunch of old people exercising. But um, it's something that helps her become more herself and like feel like herself. So I feel like Janine's really surprising to me in the book. Techno, the bird, also is like one of those things that like the things that crash into her life in a new way are the ones that um make her become someone who's able to like not necessarily like let go of grief, but like again, it's like coexist with it and like have fun or like care for something else in a new way. That opens her up to like falling in love and like all of these like other things that come as her character progresses.
Well, you mentioned Janine, and I didn't really think about asking about her, but you're right that she's one of those surprising characters. Like when she appears on the scene, we don't know what to do with her, whether she's going to be friend or foe. So I like that, she's not part of the old group, right? And so
Yeah.
that makes her really dynamic character and a catalyst for a change. So it makes sense that she's the one who brings this new thing in. I'm going to skip ahead from what I was thinking to my roller derby question then, which is can roller derby really save us from the end of the world? But when you were saying about, would you, when you were in grief, would it really make sense that you need to be sort of like beaten up a little bit and fall down and everything? But right now I'm reading Jenny Odell's How to Do Nothing. I was like reading it last night before bed, and she keeps talking about bodily connection, and that, that's part of why we're maybe dysfunctional in the online world is that it's so unembodied. And so for me right now, I'm thinking, well, it makes a lot of sense then that something so deeply physical like roller derby might actually be a good practice for grief, because the things that Huli does that are these prescribed things like go to classes, go sit in your therapist's office and talk. Like it's not even art therapy where she gets to draw or something. It's all just, you know, be a talking head. Have yes, you move through space, but everything. And roller derby is not that I participated, but I do remember roller skating as a kid. And like it's so visceral, and it really you are in your body whether you want to be or not. Because if you're not paying attention, you're just gonna get like creamed. Oh.
Yeah. No, totally. Um, I do think like I don't know if it can I think roller skating, I think fun and like being in our bodies can help us a lot. I don't know if it can save us, but maybe, you know, I feel like if we are more present and more willing to like take risks and do things and try things out and like just yeah, like be bad at something. Like I think we spend so much, it's like we graduate and then we graduate and then we graduate again and then we graduate again. And it's like we're all walking around like we're experts, but it's okay to be like a body moving through space messing up. And I feel like the lessons that come from that for Huli are like vulnerability, but also like she then, you know, that like it's like that happens, and there's like something like a really terrible thing that happens in the community where they all have to come together and show up and volunteer for people and talk to strangers who are grieving collectively. And she's part of the front line, like it or not. So it's like this like question of improvisation that comes with trying new things that then like allows you to try another thing that might, you know, be more scary. Like I can't imagine Julieta like doing that and like acting as triage for people when she's not able to necessarily even like pick herself up and like help her own wounds, right?
Right.
Um, so yeah, I love roller skating also. It's something that just brings me a lot of joy and I'm so bad. I've been doing it for a couple years now and I'm still so bad at it. And that's fine. Like I feel like it's me and a bunch of kids like at parks roller skating and they're all like woo 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 all over the place and I'm like, I'm still practicing on turning. But that's, I think it's good and it gets me out of my like headspace of constant worry or the lists of like, you know how it is, like a million random things to do or emails. Instead it makes me think of like my like next step right in front of me.
So along with the physicality, when you started out there, you mentioned taking risks. So I'm going to ask you the writer question of, did you take risks or what risks did you take when writing this book or that felt like risks to you?
Oh. I have such a love-hate relationship with Florida, that writing about this place and holding it in a way that feels critical was very tricky for me. Because I really like there's things here that I love, 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 love in community and just like people again doing the work. But in terms of policy and in terms of like the hellscape, um, that is living here sometimes. Um, I feel like the politicians have shown us who they are repeatedly, and we have to believe them. And it's not just the people in charge, it's also like the people who put them there, right? And despite living like the city I live in is like a little like progressive bubble, but like despite living here, it's like everywhere we are surrounded by people who on a daily basis um don't want like me nor my friends to necessarily like be thriving here. And that juxtaposition, I think it's easier to write about in a poem because you can go in and go out. Writing about it in a sustained way, was very hard. And I think it was something that like, thank goodness it was set in the future and that it was dystopic because it afforded me that distance. Um, because I feel like it would have been maybe an even bleaker, like a more bleak story had it not been dystopic.
So in some ways, like the fact that it was an imagined world made it a little safer for you to, I mean, I guess in some ways it is a worse world, but it's also a more optimistic one because it wasn't quite real.
Yeah.
Yeah, wow, the function of our imaginations, right? Protect us
Yeah.
from things.
Yeah.
Um, okay. So I wanted to ask this quickly about the Cometa Rangers program. And so that's a big part of that. And I'll just give this quick little explanation that Huli uh, sort of signs up to participate in a merit competition, I guess, to become one of these young rangers who are going to space. And remind me, like, are they going to go to a specific planet, like a moon or Mars, or are they going to a space station? Which is it?
First, they're going to the moon to kind of launch pad out to build a space station for interstellar travel.
Okay. And that's her version of escape. Like she will get some monetary benefits for herself and her mom. She gets to get out of there and everything. And it's all pitched in this sort of very like patriotic, gung-ho futuretopia, I guess, is
Yes.
what it's supposed to be. Um, but I was wondering, it seems like even though you give this to Hui as a possible future, um, you maybe have some doubts about it yourself. And so I wanted to ask you, what do you think happens like past the end of your book when this project goes ahead? Are they just going to reproduce the human problems and mistakes of Earth in space? Like, what are you thinking is happening with that program?
Ooh. So like any enterprise that begins as something that's publicly funded or, government funded, but also in a partnership with a private agency owned by a billionaire. Things become tricky and hairy, and I think that is evident in the book with I think they're called the Vance brothers, like these excuse me, these billionaires who own um this company that basically is like seeding money and like trying to run this agenda with the book's NASP program, which is like our NASA in the novel. And they're wanting to drive this car. Um, but they are not scientists. They are people of tech. And I think that the program's going to have a lot of problems. I think that, unfortunately for the participant, again, the whole idea for this shaped out of a current program that's like in the works, that's like a similar privatized slash funded by the government. Who knows anymore right now what's happening with it? But the recruitment for this program was like so like it was like an astronaut like being like, are you ready to go to space? Are you ready to make the future? Like, do you want to do like help your family? Like they were so in your face and like strange. And then like you would go to the page and I like, did so much research on this. I actually heard about it on the radio and I like pulled over because I was driving and I had been working on the book for a while and I knew I wanted like space to intersect somehow. And then I heard about this project and I was like, what is happening? Because the way on NPR that people were speaking about recruits for the project, for this mission, um, sounded so much like military recruitment. And I kept thinking of like, again, it's like the black and brown bodies that build everything that don't necessarily get to reap the benefits of that future or of that plan. And that like it clicked into place. So I think for Cometa, I think there will be a lot of problems. There will be a lot of sort of backstepping and figuring out because they are looking up and looking into like pouring money into something as opposed to like looking into what they can do on the planet. It needs to be more symbiotic than it is. And yeah, so I think it will be a tricky road for them.
Wasn't exactly what I was expecting, but I do see what you're saying for sure. And the tone, you got that just right in the book. That's sort of, a little bit too shiny and like the connection to military recruitment for sure. So, but despite that, or that aside, would you or perhaps teenage Gloria want to go to space?
Oh my gosh, who wouldn't want to go to space? Um, I would, yeah, you're like, I would. I don't know, like, if I would want to be in like the capsule for travel. Like, I'm like, if I could astral project myself to the moon, I would like to do that. Yeah, I feel like I'm like a yes and no. Like I think the getting there would be tough for me. It's like going anywhere. Like I love travel, but the actual like travel part of it, I'm like, oh no, why is this a thing? Um, so yes and no. I love so like I in college I took astronomy classes. I have been like a space kid forever. Like it's like
Oh,
since reading Contact probably when I was like 8 or 10 or something where I've just been like so curious about it, have like had telescopes, have been like I've gone on like starless, like dark hikes, like growing up here too, like it's really lovely because you're on the beach or you're at a nature preserve and you can see a lot in the sky. Um, it's really, I mean, I would probably go just to be able to see it, but I don't know. The travel, it freaks me out a little.
okay, that's wonderful. Love that. So thank you for joining me today. And
Thank
before
you.
we sign off, do you want to tell our listeners how they can find you if they want to check out your books or learn more?
Yes. Please support your indie bookstores and purchase This Is a Year from your indie bookstore. My personal one is Tumblr Books. They're lovely. You can order from them online. I'm on the internet under gloriamunoz.com and also on Instagram for the time being at by Gloria Munoz.
Okay, all
Thank you
right.
so much. This was lovely.
All right, thanks, Gloria. It was great talking to you today. All right, goodbye.
Bye. Thanks.